What comes to mind when people consider the richest nations in the world? And what do people imagine when they consider the world's smallest countries? Many of the richest countries are also among the smallest, which may surprise some people. Some highly wealthy and small nations, like Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Singapore, profit from having complex financial systems and tax structures that draw in outside capital and skilled labor. Other nations with sizable hydrocarbon reserves or other profitable natural resources include Qatar, Brunei, and the United Arab Emirates. Also beneficial to business are glittering casinos and throngs of tourists. The value of all goods and services produced in a country is measured by its gross domestic product, GDP, which can be divided by the number of full-time residents to determine how wealthy or impoverished a country's population is in comparison to that of another. But we can only get a more accurate picture of a country's average standard of living when we take into account inflation rates and the cost of local goods and services. The resulting number is what is known as purchasing power parity, PPP, which is frequently expressed in international dollars to allow comparisons between different countries. Here are the top richest countries in the world. Number 10. Brunei Darussalam. Malnutrition is widespread in Brunei. Despite the monarch's riches and an on-paper per capita spending power of roughly $75,000, despite a lack of data, it is estimated that about one-third of the city's 450,000 residents live in extreme poverty, with many others reliant on government assistance to make ends meet. Fortunately, the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic spared the nation. It was not immune to the oil price decline brought on by the epidemic, after reaching a 13-year high of 3.8% economic growth in 2019. GDP slumped to 1.1% in 2020 and to minus 0.6% in 2021. Number 9. United States. The U.S. economy is a free market that encourages an entrepreneurial spirit, protected by a robust system of independent government institutions. The American state not only dominates the world's total GDP, but accounts for 30% of the total wealth in the world, even though it makes up a mere 4.2% of the world population. The United States might rank as the 9th most prosperous country globally, but critics argue there is widespread inequality in race, income, universal healthcare. Nevertheless, the United States has contributed immensely to technological milestones through many successful startups and established companies. Number 8. Norway. Oil has been the main source of energy for Norway's economy ever since significant offshore deposits were discovered in the late 1960s. Being the largest producer of petroleum in Western Europe, the nation has benefited from rising prices for many years, until it didn't. Prices plummeted at the start of 2020, followed by the global pandemic, sending the krone into a free spiral. The Norwegian plummeted by 6.3% in the second quarter of that year, the most since the Second World War, and maybe since then. The economy steadily reduced its losses after the first shock, and ended the year at minus 0.7%. Then, in 2021, it made up for much of the ground lost in the earlier months, rising by almost 4% overall, the same rate the IMF predicted for 2022. That is before oil prices set new highs following Russian aggression of Ukraine. Number 7. United Arab Emirates. These three industries, agriculture, fishing, and pearl trading, used to be the country's principal sources of revenue in the Persian Gulf. Then, in the 1950s, oil was discovered, and everything changed. Today, the country's extremely cosmopolitan population enjoys great prosperity. Historic Islamic architecture coexists with glamorous shopping malls, and workers are drawn to the country by tax-free wages and year-round sunlight. Only 20% of the population are genuinely native-born. The economy of the United Arab Emirates is likewise diversifying more and more. Other than the hydrocarbon industry, which has historically dominated the economy, other industries include trade, finance, tourism, and construction. Number 6. Switzerland. This 8.6 million person nation owes much of its riches to banking and insurance services, tourism, and exports of goods including pharmaceuticals, jewels and precious metals, manufacturing, and precise instruments, from watches to medical apparatuses and computers. Is it shocking that Switzerland has the world's largest concentration of millionaires? 14.9% of adults own assets worth more than $1 million, according to Credit Suisse's most recent global wealth report. Despite this, the Swiss economy was nevertheless negatively impacted by COVID-19 in 2020, with a 2.5% decrease in production. However, things could have been worse, especially when we take into account that neighboring Italy, Spain, France, and Germany all had contractions of 8.8%, 10.8%, 7.9%, and 4.5%, respectively. Number 5. Macau SAR, previously a colony of the Portuguese Empire. This special administrative zone of the People's Republic of China has seen its wealth increase at an astonishing rate. Since the gambling industry was liberalized in 2001, this tiny peninsula south of Hong Kong, which has a population of just over 600,000 and more than 40 casinos distributed across an area of around 30 square kilometers, has become a money-making machine. That is, until the machine began to lose money instead of making it. When COVID struck, international travel ceased, and for a moment, Macau even dropped out of the top 10 richest countries list. The only nation on the list whose per capita purchasing power is currently lower than it was before the pandemic began is Macau. It was roughly $125,000 in 2019, compared to $40,000 today. Number 4. Qatar. Despite the recent increase, oil prices have generally declined since the middle of the 2010s, often dramatically. The per capita GDP of a Qatari resident was above $143,222 in 2014, only $97,846 in 2015, and continues to be lower than it has ever been. The country boasts enormous oil, gas, and petrochemical reserves, while having a tiny population of just 2.8 million, which has allowed it to consistently rank at the top of the list of the richest countries in the world for 20 years. However, despite only having 12% Qatari citizens, the country experienced COVID-19 spreading quickly in the early stages of the epidemic, particularly among low-income migrant laborers living in close quarters. Much like many other Gulf states, despite several quarantines, curfews, and lockdowns, Qatar has one of the highest rates of confirmed infections in the area. However, the economy has demonstrated some resiliency. It decreased by just 3.5% in 2020, increased by about 1.5% in 2021, and is now anticipated to expand by 3.4% as a result of an increase in gas and oil earnings, and the boost from hosting the 2022 World Cup, which will add $1.7 billion to the economy and bring 1.2 million tourists to the nation. Number 3. Ireland. Ireland seemed invincible until lately. The Irish economy was booming, while the rest of Europe was dealing with a variety of difficulties: Brexit, trade disputes with the US, refugee and migration crisis, to mention a few. It saw growth of almost 4.9% in 2019, above the 1.5% growth of the Eurozone as a whole. It would be reasonable to assume that COVID changed that. However, Ireland once more surpassed all predictions, as its GDP rose by 5.8% in 2020, and by a staggering 13% in 2021. Forecasts for 2022 are slightly more cautious, at roughly 5.2%. But most countries can only hope to reach such a level of growth. Ireland, a country with only 5 million people, was among those countries that took the brunt of the 2008 financial crisis. The island nation regained its fiscal health, increased employment rates, and saw its per capita GDP nearly double in a short period of time, after implementing some politically challenging reform measures, like significant pay cuts in the public sector and reorganizing its banking sector. Number 2. Singapore. Half of the people in the city-state were illiterate in 1965, the year it gained independence. Despite having almost no natural resources, Singapore developed into one of the most business-friendly nations in the world through perseverance and wise policies. The fact that 98% of the adult population is now literate is the most essential reason Singapore is a successful trade, manufacturing, and financial powerhouse. That does not mean that it has been spared the repercussions of the global recession. In fact, the economy fell by a record 5.4% in 2020, plunging the nation into recession for the first time in more than a decade. However, this decrease did not continue long. In 2021, the GDP increased again to 7.6%, and this year, growth is anticipated to be around 4%. Number 1. Luxembourg. Visit Luxembourg for its castles, picturesque scenery, cultural events, or delectable cuisine. Or, as many people do, you may just open an offshore account through one of its banks and never leave. It would be unfortunate, though, as this country of roughly 630,000 people, which is located right in the middle of Europe, has a lot to offer both its citizens and visitors. With the greatest level of living in the Eurozone, Luxembourg uses a significant portion of its resources to provide better housing, healthcare, and education to its citizens. Nevertheless, Luxembourg has fared better than most of its European neighbors in dealing with the pandemic. As a result, the Great Duchy's GDP increased to 6.8% in 2021, from -1.7% in 2020. However, things won't be as good this year. Growth is predicted to remain at 1.7%, as the repercussions of the Ukraine conflict, together with increasing energy and food costs, are predicted to affect consumer and corporate confidence in spending. However, the nation's GDP per capita surpassed the $100,000 barrier in 2014, and since then, it has never looked back.